And Eleanor Roosevelt, and we contribute 50%, they'll listen to us, and Eleanor Roosevelt said she thought it was just wrong to talk about the U.S. contribution. And so they didn't, and we lost. And that pattern has obtained since then. What I would do, I do not favor withdrawing from the United Nations. Jean Kirkpatrick was once asked if she favored withdrawing, and she said, she paused and thought for a moment and said, no, it's not worth the trouble. But I think what you do is change the funding mechanism. Right now, as I said, we pay 22% of the cost of most UN operations, 27% of peacekeeping. That's called an assessed contribution. It's essentially mandatory. And like all entitlement programs, if people think they're going to get your money automatically, it's not an incentive to performance. Whereas agencies in the UN system that are funded by voluntary contributions perform better because they know that the donor countries could take their money and go somewhere else. So what I would do would be to abolish the system of assessed contributions and make all contributions voluntary. And that would mean introducing the revolutionary principle that we pay only for what we want and insist that we get what we pay for. How about that? Now, a lot of people say, but if you made contributions voluntary, the other countries wouldn't contribute. Okay, what does that tell you? What does that tell you about an organization that has to be propped up by assessed mandatory contributions? So I think this would be like a tsunami through the halls of the UN. I think it would actually make it a much more effective organization, and it would certainly make the U.S. voice much better heard.
So let's talk about, you alluded to it earlier, and it's certainly on all of our minds, Iran. Something we hear about appropriately, regularly, from everybody who has a concern for that region of the world, and beyond that region, frankly. I want to learn from you some things that I certainly don't know, that I think are reflective of what many of us don't know. Do you have a sense, first of all, of what the timetable is? How close is Iran from gaining the ability to create a nuclear bomb?
Well, they're very close. And I think the first thing to stress is there's a lot we don't know about what goes on inside Iran. Our intelligence is not good. We rely on other intelligence services, for sure, but there's always a risk that when we can't be satisfied with the information, that the information will not be accurate. So given that there's a lot we don't know, let me just stress, none of that we don't know can be good news.
Right.
So what we do know and what people talk about confidently is not the entire picture. And, you know, it's very convenient because I can sum up a long recitation here simply by referring to the most recent report of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has a long appendix describing all of the aspects of Iran's nuclear activities that can only be explained if they're related to nuclear weapons. A lot of that information I had seen years before because we had gathered it from one source or another, but it wasn't made public. We gave it to the IAEA. They're not spies. They can't find this on their own. We basically give it to them. And it makes an irrefutable case that Iran has been pursuing nuclear weapons and is getting very close to it. And what that means is that they have it in their power now, if they wanted to speed up the program. It's surprising to me they haven't speeded it up years before. And it just further reinforces in my mind that maybe they did speed it up and we just don't know about it. So that the risks that we face from an Iran with nuclear weapons are very profound and very, very close to fruition.
So if I could gently press you, what's very close?
I think the Obama administration itself admitted last year that if Iran had a very stepped-up campaign, they could have a weapon within a year. And I think that's accurate. Again, just looking at publicly available information, they have enough low-enriched uranium if enriched to weapons grade levels, would be enough for 4 nuclear weapons. We know that they've been actively doing the research and technology you need, not just to have the enriched uranium, although that's always the long pole in the tent in a nuclear weapons program, but to have a functioning weapon. And I guess I better say here that, you know, if you think back to the national intelligence estimate that the U.S. issued in 2007 that said Iran had given up its nuclear weapons program, or its weapons-related activities, that report was wrong when it was written. It was distorted. It was politicized. The greatest risk of politicization of intelligence in our country is not from policymakers pressuring intelligence analysts. It's from intelligence analysts who have political objectives that they use to affect their analysis. And the 3 principal authors of that report, number one, were not intelligence people. They were all State Department people who were detailed into the intelligence community. And they wrote it because they were afraid President Bush was going to order an attack on the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and this was designed to stop it, which it did.
Were they held accountable, by the way? I mean,
no.
Dennis Ross happened to be here speaking to, some of you may have been here, and he immediately, you know, and he's certainly someone who has served in both Democratic and Republican administrations, and he immediately condemned that report. They were never held accountable for such a biased report?
No, not at all. And it's had a terribly debilitating effect on international awareness of the risks of the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and the will and the fortitude people have needed to have to deal with it effectively.
So let's talk about sanctions. It's natural. I'm not sure I understand exactly what sanctions are, and there must be a lot of different kinds of sanctions. Can you just illuminate me on that?
Well, sanctions are a part of the legacy of Woodrow Wilson, who said, look, between fruitless negotiations on the one hand and war on the other, there ought to be something in between, and sanctions were one of the less than war ideas that he had. You know, sanctions, I think, can be effective under certain circumstances, when they're massively applied very swiftly and when they're rigorously enforced. In history, there has been one example of that kind of sanctions regime, and that was the one imposed on Iraq after it invaded Kuwait. The Security Council imposed a complete, comprehensive regime of sanctions, provided for enforcement by military force, and required uniform compliance. And those sanctions were not effective in convincing Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait, and in fact never would have persuaded him to withdraw from Kuwait, which is why we sought further authorization to use force and expelled the Iraqis in Desert Storm. So when you look at the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran, number one, the U.S. has had pretty comprehensive sanctions ever since 1979. You hear about new sanctions we're imposing. Really what we're doing is taking advantage of authority we had but didn't really make clear earlier, and repealing some earlier exceptions. In 1998, 1999, Secretary Albright lifted sanctions on the importation of pistachios and rugs from Iran, because that was designed to open up channels of communication to the Ayatollahs. She obviously didn't live in California, where the pistachio industry was affected and apparently never recovered, but it didn't have any effect on the Ayatollahs either. The sanctions we've imposed on Iran in the last 10 years have been incremental, they have been partial, they have not been enforced. And even though they have imposed some cost on the regime, they've done nothing to slow down the nuclear weapons program. If you look at the financial sanctions, for example, even as they're tightened, as long as there are loopholes and Iran has access to the international financial system, its, you know, cost of borrowing may go up a few basis points, but it's still going to be able to borrow. And The largest Iranian embassy in the world today is in Caracas, Venezuela. Why? Because they're laundering money through Venezuela, through the Colombian drug cartels, through Brazil, through a variety of places to evade the sanctions. So the sanctions have not worked, and they will not work.
Okay. So, well, okay, and they will not work.
They will not work. Look, North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country on earth.
Right.
It's exploded 2 nuclear devices.
Right. Well, that was actually, I'm not sure if it was Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il, the father or the son, when they were developing. It was during your time at the UN, was it not? And there were sanctions like crazy. They now have nuclear weaponry. They have a massive starvation camp. The country is essentially probably the most...
It's a prison camp.
Yeah.
Look, how bad is it in North Korea? When World War II ended, the Korean Peninsula, which had been under Japanese control since 1895, was partitioned between North and South. Both parts of the peninsula were desperately poor, but the bulk of the industry was in the north.
Right.
Okay, but it was one ethnic population from essentially the same base. Today, the average North Korean is 3 to 5 inches shorter than the average South Korean and weighs 20 to 30 pounds less. That's what the North Korean regime has done to its people. So when you hear diplomats or others say, well, we just need to persuade the North Korean leadership that it's in the interest of their people to give up their nuclear weapons program, you're talking to a wall. Yeah. They don't care about the interests of their people, who are shorter than the people across the demilitarized zone.
Okay, so if sanctions don't work, I mean, you actually, tell me if this is correct, encouraged Israel to launch a military strike in Bushehr because they were developing a nuclear reactor, yeah. And if once they had essentially gone online, that if Israel attacks too late, then you hold this radioactive material in the atmosphere. They didn't attack. Did they go online?
It is in the process of going online now. Bushehr is a conventional 1,000-megawatt nuclear reactor. It will produce over its lifetime enough plutonium in the spent fuel for hundreds of nuclear weapons. It is the first time that Israel has allowed a reactor of that size to go into operation ever. Faced with a similar reactor in Iraq, it bombed in 1981. Faced with another similar reactor being built by North Koreans, my friends the North Koreans, in Syria. Israel attacked that in September of 2007. It did not attack Bushehr. And the point you're making is an important one, because once the nuclear fuel rods are inserted into the reactor, if you attack the reactor, you'll release radiation. And Bushehr is right on the Persian Gulf. You'll release it into the atmosphere and the Gulf, and it will all sweep downstream to the Arab states on the southern shore.
So in 1981, it was in Osirak, correct?
Right.
In Iraq, and Israel took it out. And then something happened in Syria mysteriously, and their reactor was taken out. Those were both, if I'm not mistaken, above-ground reactors.
Right, so is Bushehr.
Okay, so is Bushehr?
Sure.
So, first of all, aren't most of the reactors that Iran is working on now, or much of their work being done underground? Isn't it being done in a lot of different sites? And what happens if Israel attacks 1 or 2 sites? What is the possibility that Iran can respond with massive weaponry?
Yeah. The key to essentially ending Iran's nuclear weapons program for a sustained period of time is to break its control over the nuclear fuel cycle at 1 or more points. There are 3 in particular: uranium conversion, uranium enrichment, and then separate, related to the reactors, the production of heavy water and heavy water reactors. Uranium conversion is the process of taking uranium from a solid state to a gas. There is only one facility we know of in Iran. It's at Esfahan. It's above ground. We know exactly where it is. The principal uranium enrichment facility now is at Natanz. We know where that is. It's underground, but Israel has the capability of destroying that facility. There are others, the